Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us virtually this year. Before we start, I want to share with you some Zoom etiquette essentials. To help keep background noise to a minimum, please make sure to mute your microphone when you're not speaking. This webinar will be recorded. While we encourage everyone to keep their cameras on, we advise you to position your camera properly. If you choose to use a web camera, be sure it is in a stable position and focused at eye level. Simultaneous translation is available to English and Arabic. In your meeting or webinar controls at the bottom of your screen, please click on the interpretation button where you have the sign of the globe. Then please click and choose the language that you would like to hear. The Arabic will be the German, as there is no Arabic option on Zoom. If you wish to hear the interpreted language only, you have the option to click on the mute original audio. We will have a Q&A session after each panel, so please type your question in the Q&A section or in the chat. And now I would like to welcome Mr. Bert Setrakian, the President of the Armenian Benevolent Union, and Joseph Mahout, the Director of the Haitham Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, to deliver their opening remarks. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Mahout, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed my privilege to join you from as far as New York City for this conference on genocide in the Middle East viewed through a gender lens. Fortunately, we can be thankful for the technologies that has created means of communication such as Zoom, which allow us to join such gathering virtually and not to be cut off from interface communication. The Armenian General Benevolent Union, which is commonly known as AGBU, is the largest Armenian national organization founded in 1906 in Cairo, with a presence through its educational, cultural, social, and humanitarian programs operating in more than 34 countries and headquartered in New York. As its worldwide president, I welcome the initiative of the AGBU Lebanon in joining the organization of this conference with the prestigious Haitham Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the dear American University of Beirut. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very appreciative that this year's focus of the panels are women and children, victims of acts of genocide and human rights violations. Indeed, there is a common thread, and looking back, we realize that the perpetrators never spare the killing or physical abuse of women and children. I wonder whether this is a reflection of an instinctive reaction that women are the source of life and children represent the future of a nation or an ethnic group that the aggressors wish always to annihilate. First, I welcome the initiative and I commend the Haitham Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at AUB and AGBU Lebanon, and their commitment every December 9th to recognizing the International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of the victims of the crime of genocide and of the prevention of this crime. We are proud to remind the world that this resolution of the United Nations was initiated by the representative of Armenia to the UN, who most recently served as foreign minister of the country and who had the heavy burden of sitting at the table recently to practically sign the surrender of the Nagorno-Karabakh to the Azeri aggression, which in less than 5 weeks caused the deaths of more than 6,000 young people, about 10,000 injured, and over 60,000 displaced refugees using the heavy weaponry supplied by Turkey and the international community. About a century after the first genocide of the 20th century, we witnessed again killings by the grandchildren of the perpetrators of the genocide, of the grandchildren of the genocide survivors. And the world remained idle once again, without any voice raised by the reputed civilized international community which support so-called Western civilization values. Unfortunately, it has been proven that even in modern times, with all the goodwill of people, violence against men, women, and children is not being prevented. We welcome and praise the efforts of various NGOs and civil society organizations and encourage them to pursue their efforts through conferences and gatherings like this one in order to alert the world to atrocities committed globally, even today in remote areas of the world. I thank all the conference speakers, panelists, and participants, and I thank Mrs. Mireille Kharamirian and the AGBU District Committee of Lebanon, its director and staff members, but above all, a special thank you to the American University of Beirut and to the prestigious Issam Ferris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, wishing them continuous success in the endeavors that they are pursuing. We are proud that AGBU is partnering with the Issam Faris Institute in the endeavor over the last 4 years. I wish you success during this conference, and hopefully we'll have a more peaceful world in the coming years or decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Satrakian. It's an honor to have you with us, and it's an honor for us at IFI to partner with AGBU, which is more than only a prestigious NGO, if you can say so, but which is today one of the main actors of a very important community worldwide. We couldn't have a more timely theme to gather around tonight, namely genocides. We can say without exaggeration, but I think that your debates will delve on that the 20th century could be characterized as a century of genocides, unfortunately. It started with a genocide, the Armenian genocide. This is a sad and morbid coincidence. Then it was followed by the genocide or the ethnocide that the World War I provoked, the war that is in fact a European butchery, if you can say so. Then World War II with also the huge amount of ethnocide, genocides, and Holocausts that happened at that period. Then followed by the 1948 drama, the tragedy, the Palestinian tragedy, and the Arab-Israeli conflict that started then. Lebanon's war was also maybe on a more miniatural level, a genocide also by many aspects. We have seen mass displacements, mass war murders, more war crimes, and etc. Iraq followed then, and later on we have witnessed very close to us the Syrian endless butchery and bloodshed that is still going on, although at a lower scale and at a smaller pace. But still with huge amount of victims unaccounted for. This year, the joint event that IFI has the honor to do with AGBU will add to this question of genocide, war crimes, human injustice, and etc., a particular lens, which is the lens of gender. This is also not a coincidence. This year, 2020, is the 20th anniversary of the launch by the UN 20 years ago of a very important agenda, the Women, Peace and Security Initiative. And IFI has just announced a partnership with the WPS agenda launched by the UN, and we are embedding at IFI as of now a program devoted to women, gender issues, issues of war and peace, issues of world security and diplomacy, and things related to it. So this is why we are very glad, and this seminar tonight, or this webinar tonight, is something that is very welcome for us at IFI. As you said, Mr. Satrakian, this is the 4th year that we are partnering together, IFI, AUB, of course, and AGBU. We are very happy with this collaboration. Issues like the ones you are working on are not at all alien to us. They are even at the core, at the crux of what we are intending or what we are in fact supposed to work on. International affairs, issues of security, issues of humanitarian plight. So this is something very important for us, and I can't but thank you and thank your Lebanese counterparts, Mrs. Arine Ghazarian especially, and Mirai Khanamirian, who is not here tonight, for this very good opportunity they gave us 4 years ago to be able to collaborate together. I'm also very glad and very proud to have on this screen a very prestigious lineup of speakers. I think that the debates will be incredibly rich. Some of you are renowned worldwide specialists of this issue, and I thank them for their generosity and their time. And I really and seriously and sincerely look forward for a longer, let's say, collaboration path and track between IFI and AGBU. And I hope that next ones will be in physical presence, and that we will be able to welcome you and welcome maybe international speakers to IFI and to AUB in order to pursue this long-lasting collaboration. I wish you luck. I'm very interested in hearing your debates, and I look forward to see some of you in the future. Thank you very much, and have a good panel.
We will now start our conference. Please allow me to introduce our moderator for panel 1, Women the Core Victims of Genocide since 1915, Professor Shibli Mallat. Shibli Mallat is an academic and practicing international lawyer. As a legal practitioner and consultant, Professor Mallat advises governments, corporations, and individuals in Middle Eastern and international law. As an international criminal lawyer, he has successfully represented victims in cases such as the Sabra and Shatila massacres against Sharon et al. In Belgium, the case of Musa Sadr and his companions against Gaddafi in Lebanon and Italy, and he helped set up Index, an international NGO for the victims of Saddam Hussein in the 1990s. He was also active in the setting up of the STL in 2005 to 2007. He has been active politically against authoritarian rulers, especially in Lebanon and in Iraq, and remains involved in policy and human rights advocacy. Mallat law offices have represented the Middle East branch of Amnesty International since 1999. Professor Mallat recently retired from the chairs he held as Presidential Professor of Law at the University of Utah and as an EU Jammouni Professor of Law at St. Joseph University in Lebanon. He is the author or editor of over 40 books in Arabic, English, and French, including Introduction to Middle Eastern Law, Philosophy of Nonviolence, where he discusses crimes against humanity and genocide, and the normalization of Saudi law. Professor Mallat, the platform is yours.
Without further ado, let me ask Dr. Darina Bushdid to present her talk on women in armed conflicts, victims or agents of change. Dr. Sabiba Abishdid is director of CISH UNESCO. She has been very active in human rights, in teaching, in advocacy. She is an arbitrator and a consultant, and has prepared and given multiple conferences on national, regional, and international level. The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I'll be talking about women in armed conflict, victims or agents for change. In fact, I will start with an overview. You know, women are portrayed as victims of conflict, and they are, in fact, they are often portrayed like this, but they are, in fact, they experience armed conflict much the same way as men. They are killed, they are injured, they are disabled and tortured. They are targeted with weapons, and they suffer social and economic displacement. They can suffer psychological impact as loved ones dies or they witness violence against their families and neighbors. They are also at a high risk of diseases, so they face these risks, for example, the STDs, the sexual transmitted diseases, and AIDS. They are affected by the resource reductions that result from armed conflict. They can join or are forced to join armed forces or insurgency movements. But at the same time, they do care for the wounded, for the sick, for the despairing and displaced, and may be among the most outspoken advocates for peace. Okay, this is being said, women, it's true that women are victims of war, but they are also agents and active participants in war. They are often very active in civil society and in peace movements. And they are frequently largely neglected, unfortunately, once peace occurs and once the conflict ends. When we talk about violence and armed conflict, especially in the case of women, we're talking mainly about sexual violence and gender-based violence, so such as rape, forced marriage, forced impregnation, forced abortion, torture, trafficking, sexual slavery. All these are considered as weapons of war that are integral to many of today's conflicts. We have in these cases also the women who are kidnapped and they become army wives. We have the cases of widowship or widows. Women also, therefore, they resort, to prostitution to support their families, and they can become, of course, victims of genocide and slavery or enslaved for labor. And this will have naturally a significant and lasting harm. So I'm trying to be brief. What is more important to note here is that the specific experience of women and girls in armed conflict, it greatly depends upon their status in societies before armed conflict breaks out, which means that we find that where cultures of violence and discrimination against women and girls exist prior to conflict, these abuses are likely to be worsened during conflict. And similarly, if women are not allowed to be part of decision-making before conflict, it is usually extremely difficult for them to become involved in decisions during the conflict itself or the peace process and after the conflict period. So women and girls are not only victims of armed conflict, they can be also agents of peace, agents, and even agents of war. They can make choices, they possess critical perspectives on their situations and organize collectively in response to those situations. But they can also perpetrate violence and can support violence perpetrated by others. They can be active in peace processes. This is a positive thing that I'll be talking about it later on. However, formalized processes of peace, they most of the time exclude women and girls from participation, especially when we talk about negotiations, agreements, and reconstruction plans. But women and girls actively involved in rebuilding local economies and civil society, we remark that they are left behind when formal peace processes begin. If we have a look at the international community or international legal framework, also very briefly, we have, for example, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 of 2001, which included the special needs of women and girls during repatriation and resettlement, rehabilitation, reintegration, and post-conflict reconstruction. Regarding the international humanitarian law, also here we have a special protection for women. So it's granted by international humanitarian law to give them additional protection and rights. They provide them general protection, specifically, for example, based on the principles of non-discrimination and the principle of humane treatment and the protection against the effects of hostilities. And also it provides them more specific protection that is generic or specific. Generic, like for example, Article 14 of the Third Geneva Convention, that states that women should be treated with all the regard due to their sex, and specific protection, more specific protection, like for example, by the provision of separate detention quarters and sanitary facilities for female prisoners of war. So women are more or particularly vulnerable as a result of armed conflict, and they are susceptible to marginalization, poverty, and suffering that is engendered by armed conflict, especially when they are already victims of discrimination in peacetime. So they are exposed more to danger. They have to cope with situations of stress, of trauma. They can have special needs, and they need special assistance, like for example pregnant women or nursing mothers. So that's why they are more considered more vulnerable. Sometimes also they are more attacked and threatened from their own community, for example, for not wearing a veil or by cutting their hair, or conversely, they may be targeted by the enemy in order to destroy or subvert this role. But despite all these things, they are not necessarily vulnerable, and even they can display remarkable strength, as evidenced by their role as combatants or agents for peace, or by the roles they assume in wartime to protect and support their families. They can be extremely courageous and resilient, but also they can put their ingenuity and coping skills to full use in their daily roles as heads of household, breadwinners, and care providers within their families. And this leads to a change in their traditional role, and they start to assume a new role because they are now getting a greater responsibility. They are considered heads of households and breadwinners, especially when they are widows. Okay, if we focus more on women in the Middle East, we noticed that, since 2010, we have the Middle East particularly have experienced continuing violence and instability in this region, and there has been a dramatic rise of extremism and fundamentalism, and we all know the violations of human rights that were committed by Daesh. So women in the Middle East, of course, they are victims, and they are victims of violence. They have suffered disproportionately from food shortages. We have a very big number of widows and female-headed households. Their economic role was transformed during these wars, and many have been pushed into work in the informal sector, and they have become the sole providers for their families. We noticed that in this region also we have a rise in early marriage. Violence against women has also increased a lot in this region. And to take some examples during the last 10 years, based on different studies, we noticed that we had an increase in gender-based violence in the refugee communities of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, for example, in Jordan, also sexual and gender-based violence. In Iraq, with the sexual violence, especially among the Christian minority of Yazidis, slavery, abduction, and trafficking of women in Iraq. We have many cases of rape in Syria, Yemen and Iraq, forced marriage, early marriage in Yemen, in the occupied also Palestinian territories, and specifically child marriage among the Syrian refugee communities. Okay, they are victims of war in the Middle East, but they are also agents of change, and they can be and they should be agents of change, of course. Beyond the negotiation table, women should be viewed as agents of change and drivers of social cohesion at the local and national levels. We noticed that in Syria and Yemen, other than being victims, women were active mediators, and they have led efforts to resolve land and water disputes. They convinced militias to camp away from their communities and campaigned for the release of detainees. So women should not be seen as powerless. They have to mobilize for peace. They have to be seen as individuals that are able to play a major part in the achievement of a long-term and stable peace. they can play a role in peace building and societal development and in all activities for peace and also in the reconciliation process. It's also important to have more women in peacekeeping missions, since in the UN peacekeeping forces in the Middle East, they have only 4 operations. Okay, and lastly, they have also to play a more important role in their participation in the peace talks. This will ensure the effectiveness and sustainability of peace building efforts. So they must be provided with seats and decision-making powers at the peace negotiation tables. They will not only signal inclusion, but will enhance the quality and durability of peace. This is very important. A last thing, a last idea, they also have to be considered into the social protection programs that target impoverished girls, widows, and female refugees. They need more urgent investment in their education and health, and we have to address gender-based violence loudly and support women's work and economic empowerment. That is very important and very critical, and all the peace building and reconstruction efforts. I hope I was not long.
Thank you, that's perfect. I just sent you a note about the 10 minutes. It's very hard to moderate virtually, but you have been wonderful with time. I propose we take 10 minutes or a bit less for questions. I understand the questions will come up on your screen. So there's a little box saying questions and answers. If you could kindly write your question or comment, I will be able to see it and convey it to Dr. Abishid. I think she might see it as well. Meanwhile, until a question, may I suggest, may I make a short comment, Dr. Abishid? This, what you've presented, is a very remarkable overview and brings our attention to the general situation of subordination of women in the Middle East in particular, from a legal and from a factual perspective. This obviously gets worse in times of armed conflict. The question is, and I believe what you say is all shared universally, certainly shared by most of us on this panels. I've had, like many other colleagues, been engaged in various forms of standing up against violence perpetrated in particular against women in the course of my career. And academically, I do remember a participation with a topic, with a study that ESQA did back in 2009, entitled very specifically Protecting Women in the ESQA region, in other words, mostly in the Middle East, in times of conflict. My recollection of the study was that there are quite a few instruments in international law, particularly in international criminal law, to, if not protect women, at least offer them some remedies. Now, very generally, this has been acknowledged. It has been acknowledged, as you mentioned, in UN Security Council resolutions. There's in particular the UN Security Council Resolution 1820 back in 2008 that specifically considers that rape of women is a crime against humanity during war. There are also a number of decisions from the international tribunals, in particular the Yugoslav and the Rwandan tribunals, that talk about rape as an act of genocide. And in those particular cases, of course, the perpetrators who were in the dock were sentenced to life for various acts of genocide, specifically also the violence exerted against women, mostly in the shape of. The problem that I see looking back at the paper and at your presentation today is the great difficulty of finding effective remedies for women in our region. So all these cases concern women elsewhere. Even in Sudan, where the Darfur massacres were particularly brutal and particularly brutal against women, we haven't seen yet anything coming out that women can vindicate as a victory, a court victory, or any form of remedy that, that they would be entitled to under both the de jure and the de facto situation of violence they are exerted to. So my question really for you, waiting for the other questions, is what remedies are you suggesting that could be efficient to redress a situation which is appalling?
Okay, well, you know, if we consider the international humanitarian law, international criminal law, international human rights law, we do have, of course, protection of women that is specific for women and as a vulnerable category, but also all the provisions apply to women as man, equally as man. I mean, the same. So rules apply to both. It is true that we had in the region, especially in the Middle East, many cases of rape in the different villages by soldiers, by different parties, and this is considered also this is a challenging thing because most of the time it's going in impunity. You know, the result is impunity. So they are the perpetrators are not sanctioned or punished because of this. I have mentioned very briefly the protection under international humanitarian law, that this is the specific one, the general and the specific one, without going into details. But I wanted to say that there is, in fact, a protection, special protection for women, and that is for them as a vulnerable category, and that should be how to say it, implemented, I mean, or preserved during wars. But the problem is that at the end of the day, when we want to punish these perpetrators, this is what is the problem. Usually they go without being punished. The rules are here. We have this international legal framework. We have all these the legal basis to punish them, but they are not always respected.
Very good. Well, we're coming up to the next session. I can't see a question in the chat room, but rest assured there'll be an occasion to go back to Dr. Abishtit in the general session. Meanwhile, I suggest that we move on to the next speaker, who is Dr. Carol Mann. Carol Mann is the founder of Women More. Oh, just to remind you that that Dr. Darina Saliba Abishtit is the director of the UNESCO Center for Human Studies in Byblos, for those who are lucky to be in Beirut. Dr. Carol Mann is the founder of Women in War. I had a look at the site. It's quite impressive. She is based in Paris. She has a PhD in sociology from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and she's a specialist of gender and armed conflict. She teaches at Paris 8 and combines academic research, writing and publishing in English and French in various areas of conflict and war in the world, including Pakistan, Congo, Lebanon, or Ukraine. The international conferences organized through the NGO Women in War in conflict zones brings together these activists and academics and local women's groups. She's published numerous articles and studies in France, US, and the UK on the subject. Dr. Mann, on the subject of developments in law and practice for gender-based violence in the context of genocide. Your 10 minutes. Thank you.
Right, I'm going to talk about gender-based violence in the context of genocide, developments in law and practice. The first thing I want to say is that this conference is based on the premise that all genocides are gendered in the way that they affect men and women differently. Recognizing this in itself has been revolutionary because this was not the case until recently. The Armenian genocide and the Holocaust have mostly been analyzed in terms of the planned killing of undifferentiated human beings, the male being the generic victim of extermination. But in fact, this was based on the Geneva Convention of December 1948. The one provision they made at the time in 1948 was, I just quoted, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. I mean, this can imply everything, including castration and other aspects which needed defining. Now, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, that's the ICC, drafted in 1998, 50 years later, took up exactly the same definition. They didn't go further. The definition being, this is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. But then the ICC, and especially the trials which Dr. Malad just mentioned, the trials that followed made wartime rape a crime against humanity that legitimizes persecution of perpetrators, those who actually commit acts, as well as those who order them. That's important. Now, one of the most important features, as far as I'm concerned, is that crimes against women are no longer catalogued as crimes of honor, and that's a big feature in the Middle East, or as you say in French, outrage à la pudeur, which in both cases imply that for women to be recognized as victim, virginity is more or less a prerequisite. Henceforth, crimes against women are treated as crimes of violence, and that's very, very important. Remember, until recently, rape was seen as collateral damage and the fatality of any war. You know the motto, rape, loot, pillage, which is basically soldiers let on the loose. And in fact, what this has meant is that sexual violence has been depoliticized. And instead of the perpetrators, it is the victims which have borne the shame and the guilt. And it's still the case in the Middle East. I mean, just think of just about any war. You know, it's and you know, the Armenians, the Jews in the Holocaust, or even the German women raped by Soviet soldiers in 1945. I mean, everyone. In many cases, after this, you see the victims of a genocide and genocidal rape, because it's triple harm at least, because women tend to be rejected by their families once they have been raped. So this is why it's completely underreported. And this happened in Bosnia, where women suffered double, even triple harm by being raped, forced to marry the child, and being cast out by husbands and fathers. And then many women were forced themselves to cut any family bond with the child, as if the child were not hers and were a symbol of an offense to family purity. Same thing with Rwanda, same thing with so many similar cases, and I have to say, especially in the Middle East. Now, in the most recent genocide, which I will come back to later, we'll see if I've got time, that of the Yazidis in Iraq. By the way, I don't know, Darina, Yazidis are not Christian. They're a separate religion. They're monotheistic, in fact, but they're a completely separate religion. The Yazidis in Iraq made an exceptional effort. They really did take the steps to reintegrate rape victims in their families, because otherwise they would have been rejected. So the elders went around doing that. despite the norms of the Kurdish and regional honor codes. That's exceptional. That the children were not taken in is a big problem. If I have time, I'll come back to that. You see, genocide has been left out of all these considerations as if it were totally separate from violence against women. Whereas what needs to be shown is gendered violence is at the very heart of the gendered proposition. That for me is extremely important. Now, this imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group as an aim and a crime is what genocide is all about, eradicating the present and the future, especially the future. Now, the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, ICTY, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, I'm saying the initials because I'll come back to it, helped to shift the view of sexual violence from an inevitable byproduct of war to an actual weapon of war. It is really significant that the actual criminalizing of sexual violence happened in trials that took place in the trials. In trials that took place of the two recognized genocides that took place in the latter part of the 20th century, ex-Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Now, the overlap between sexual violence and genocide occurred during a famous Rwandan trial. It was a famous Akayesu trial, where the court, for the first time, listed a number of measures that fitted into the provision that I've repeatedly quoted, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Okay, now here we have it. This is what I'm going to read to you. The chamber holds that the measures intended to prevent births, that is to say genocide. What I'm going to read about is the heart of genocide. Within the group should be construed as sexual mutilation, the practice of sterilization, forced birth control, separation of the sexes, prohibition of marriages. In patriarchal societies, this is the legal document, right? In patriarchal societies where membership of a group is determined by the identity of the father, an example of a measure intended to prevent births within a group is a situation where, during rape, a woman of the said group is deliberately impregnated by a man of another group with the intent to have her birth a child who will consequently not belong to the mother's group. That was the big problem in Bosnia and Croatia. Furthermore, the chamber notes that measures intended to prevent births within the group may be physical, but can also be mental. For instance, rape can be a measure intended to prevent births when the person raped refuses subsequently to procreate, in the same way that members of a group can be led through threats and trauma not to procreate. But these assaults have been criminalized, but there's still some missing, which are really important. For instance, crimes against pregnant women. It was mentioned, you know, it's sort of looking after special needs. This goes this goes beyond that. Wait a minute, I just the violence against pregnant women is neglected. Serbs and more recently Syrian snipers shooting into women's bellies. I mean, this happens more than one imagines. Women giving birth in bombings and camps. The pain of pregnant women having to wait for hours at checkpoints, as in Palestine. Not to mention male rape, because that gender is also about men. Male rape, which is a real and hidden issue in Syria. As you can see, legal issues concerning the gender dimension, have been, there is a big confusion. I'm not a lawyer, but I can see that this would need some kind of legal clarification. Criminalizing acts of violence committed within a genocide from a gendered perspective needs to be constructed from existing laws that define each term used and then further related to genocide. The problem lies in the relationship between a crime against an individual and the genocidal violence towards a group. Now, having said all that, yes, international tribunals have brought a few rapists to justice, but so few. Since 2000, only 5 men and women in Rwanda have been convicted, 23 men in the former Yugoslavia, 1% from the Congo, the east of Congo, you know, I mean, it's the rapes are incessant. And as far as the Yazidi genocide is concerned, nothing has happened for reasons I will explain a bit later, unless I can continue. I haven't looked how long I've spoken, or perhaps I'll just stop here and we'll take it up afterwards. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much. I'm sure that we'll come back to further questions in the general session, but meanwhile, it is open for questions to the floor. I had the privilege of reading the notes of Dr. Iman before the conference. I must say it's a very powerful argument to remind people that the gendering of violence in mass crime, including crimes against humanity and genocide, this gendering has been extremely behind in the language of the law. What has pushed it forward, as she mentioned, is the language that has appeared in some decisions of the International Court. I think the ICC prosecutor in particular has raised it as well in the prosecution. In other words, to make a particular note that violence against women is an integral part of the efforts to eradicate the population covered by the Genocide Convention. And to that extent, there needs to be an improvement of the language to make that characteristic of violence perpetrated against women much more at the forefront of the need to end impunity. In this context, unfortunately, as in everything else, the Middle East is behind. And so when one looks at the degree of impunity that continues with regard to what happened in Darfur 10 years ago, what happened under the rule of Daesh 3 years ago, one can only shudder at the difficulty to punish those criminals who are accused of gendered crimes under both the Genocide Convention and the International Criminal Court Convention, the Convention of Rome. Maybe, I mean, there are a number of cases now rising in the domestic courts as opposed to the international courts, and in particular for the crimes perpetrated by Daesh. It's just starting. There will be cases developing in Iraq, probably in Europe, for, in particular, crimes in the period between 2013 2015, because there have been a number of prisoners made who belonged to Daesh and who will find their comeuppance in court cases. It may be that this would be an important occasion for the Yazidi community, for instance, to mobilize, to make sure that the treatment of the crimes is not oblivious to gender. So, Dr. Iman, this is my comment on your excellent report.
Can I add something about the ISIS, which I wrote? You know, I mean, yes, some people are going to be tried for having participated in killings, because killings are, well, so to speak, internationally recognized and by any religion. I'm not a lawyer, but as far as I can see, one of the problems is that ISIS conducted sexual slavery according to specific law code. You know, they revived ancient Islamic law, and you know, saying that people who are not people of the book, that is to say Christians or Jews, were made legitimate slaves, and they couldn't be sold to anyone. They were sold as spoils of war through a legal network. So, in fact, what are we opposing? Whereas killing, there's there's no discussion about it. What are we doing? International law versus religious law? Because that's what it's going to end up as. I think legally it's going to be very interesting, because on both sides are going to claim, I don't know what dominates something else, what can be more powerful, or what can be more objective in a society that's getting more and more religious and sort of community based and religion. So I think that's going to be one of the problems.
Well, it may be intellectually interesting. I don't see that it can stand in a court of law in any way to revive the argument that slavery was an absolutely legal behavior in the classical ages or in the medieval ages. No, but I think more importantly, there must be a mobilization of women and their lawyers to bring up in those cases coming up, not so much the fear that medieval laws will be invoked by the perpetrators. That will not go very far in court. But the fact that courts tend to be oblivious to the gender dimension of mass crimes.
Yeah. Okay. No, but it's just because I'm thinking that there are countries like Pakistan or, for instance,
I don't know if it'd be interesting to see if
religious
cases come up in Pakistan. You might be right. I mean, the area one should watch is Iraq, because there's always a fear that in Eastern countries will be a more conducive area where laws that laws that pretend to be Islamic are brought up before the judges. But even there, my sense is that in Iraq it won't go very far. I mean, one of the most extraordinary moments in the ISIS tragedy was that Iraqi Yazidi woman MP who spoke in parliament as the massacres were taking place in ways that are just extraordinary for history. I still think that maybe in the last 10 years of Iraqi parliamentary occasions, this was by far the most powerful.
Yes, I just would like to add that in a place like Afghanistan, which is about to be taken over totally by Taliban, rape victims are jailed because they have committed sexual acts outside marriage. So the women's jails are full of rape victims. Men buy their way out. But the woman will be a victim, and she will be rejected by a family and condemned. So
this is a big problem, and I really don't see, especially with the setbacks that quote unquote the West is facing in Afghanistan, and the real danger that Taliban take over, that we're back to a situation before 2011. I'm being reminded that time passes from Ms. Gazarian, so I should, if I may, move to our third speaker. Thank you very much, Dr. Mann. So it's my pleasure to introduce a young lady, Ms. Maya Jazini. She has 2 bachelor degrees from the Lebanese University. She also holds 2 masters, or about to hold another one. She is currently a curriculum developer, trainer, and coach at Search for Common Ground, the well-known NGO. Her training fields include nonviolent communication, a subject that I have very much at heart, active citizenship, peace-building approaches, and community dialogue in various Arab countries. Ms. Jazini will speak to us for 10 minutes on the role of women as actors in effective peace-building. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mallat. Allow me to speak Arabic. Thank you. مرحبا جميعا. حكون عم شارك معكم باوربوينت اللي هو دور المرأة ببناء السلام. بس قبل اسمحوا لي بس لنقدر نحكي عن دور المرأة، خلوني بس تعرف انا وياكم شو يعني السلام، بما انه نحن بدنا نحكي عن دور المراه ببناء السلام. شو يعني السلام؟ يا هل ترى السلام هو عكس الحرب؟ هن اسئله هول نعمل عليهم ريفلكشن. هل من المستحيل انه نعرف عن السلام من دون ما نكون عم نذكر الحرب؟ من العدل justice انه نعرف عن السلام بس كغياب للحرب او عدم وجودها؟ يا هل ترى في ظروف سلميه بس منا عادله؟ هولي اسئله هيك بس نكون عم نفكر فيهم. ممكن. طيب شو هو مفهوم السلام؟ السلام ما بيعني بس انه نكون ما في نزاعات عنيفه، وهون عم بدي اشدد على كلمه عنيفه، لانه اذا بدنا نرجع لشو يعني كونفليكت، شو تعريف النزاع؟ النزاع هو حاله طبيعيه ببطل طبيعي لما بيصير عنيف. اذا السلام ما بيعني بس غياب النزاعات العنيفه، بالعكس هو عنده معاني كثير اوسع، مثل وجود العدل، الانصاف، واحترام حقوق الانسان. وهيدا الشيء حدده الباحث النرويجي جالتون، وحكى عن جانبين من جوانب السلام اللي هن السلام الايجابي والسلام السلبي. وتحديدا حكى عن السلام السلبي اللي بيعني في غياب الحرب. اما السلام الايجابي اللي هو بيحكي فيه عن غياب كل من العنف المباشر وغير المباشر. هون فينا نحكي عن AGBU اللي هو العنف على النوع، على اساس النوع الاجتماعي، وايجاد حاله من الانصاف والعداله والتنميه. هلا بنشوف ليه عم بعرف على السلام قبل ما احكي عن دور المرأة. منظمة الأمم المتحدة بتعرف ثقافة السلام على أنها منظومة من القيم والمبادئ والمفاهيم والتوجيهات والمواقف والسلوكيات اللي بتأسس للسلام بمعناه الأشمل. ولما بحكي هون عن شمولية عم بحكي عن عدل، عم بحكي عن إنصاف، عم بحكي عن توزيع الفرص بشكل عام. وهذا الشيء بيساعد على أنه نستثمر ونحمي ونأمن استمرارية للمجتمع. من هون اسمحوا لي كون عم اعرفكم على دور المرأة بنشر ثقافة السلام. باعتبار انه هي مكون اصيل بالعالم، المرأة عندها دور اساسي انها تنشر ثقافة السلام على كافة المستويات، ان كان الخاص، هون لما بحكي خاص عم بحكي من البيت ومن الاسرة، ولا العامة على صعيد اقليمي ودولي. وهيدا الامر بيتطلب شرط حتمي، وهو قبول انه نعطي المرأة انها تلعب دور اساسي بهاي العمليه، لانه عمليه السلام مثل ما قلنا هي عمليه طويله المدى وبتتطلب شروط كبيره. طيب بيتركز دور المراه بنشر ثقافه السلام على 3 اشياء اساسيه. اولا السلام الذاتي والشخصي، السلام الاسري والعائلي، والسلام الوطني والاقليمي والدولي. وهيدي المرتكزات يعني اذا بنشوفها هن مش بس مكملين لبعض، هي انطلاق، وحده منهم منطلق للاثنين الباقيين. انطلاقا من هون شو هو عناصر السلام الذاتي؟ ما بتقدر المرأة انها تلعب دور بانها تنشر ثقافة السلام اذا هي نفسها ما حاسة بهذا السلام الداخلي اللي جواتها او حاسة بالاطمئنان. اثنين، لتقدر المرأة تلعب هيدا الدور ما بده يكون في عوامل مؤثرة. شو هي العوامل اللي بتأثر سلبا؟ ما بدي كثير زيد على الدكتور صليبة، حكيت شوي بس هيك سريعا، اللي هو عدم المساواة، عدم الحصول على المكتسبات الأساسية والاجتماعية والعملية، الشعور بالإجحاف من وراء قوانين الأحوال الشخصية اللي هو سن الزواج، الإرث، الطلاق، تعدد الزوجات، الزواج بالإكراه، التبعية. وأكيد هيدي عوامل بتخلي المرأة تحس حالها عاجزة، وبالتالي بتبطل في عندها سلام داخلي. اثنين، اللي هو العنصر الثاني الرئيسي، السلام الأسري والعائلي. كمان المرأة ما فيها المرأة تنشر السلام داخل أسرتها إذا هي ما كانت عايشة سلام. يعني اذا هي عايشه حرب ما حسمت نتيجتها بعد، هيدا الموضوع حيكون عم بخليها ما تعمل السلام داخل اسرتها. ومن هون خلينا نحكي على شيء كثير مهم، انه المراه عندها دور فطري اللي هو بتقوم على نشر ثقافه السلام بين ابنائها، على نشر المحبه، التعاون، التفاعل والتنميه. بس كمان في عوامل سلبيه مؤثره على هذا الموضوع اللي هو غلبة الذكورية. عم بحكي داخل الشرق الأوسط، ما بالضرورة هيدول العوامل يكونوا بلبنان، بس ممكن يكونوا موجودين بالشرق الأوسط كشرق أوسط. غلبية الذكورية، النظر على المرأة على أنه هي عنصر استهلاكي منه منتج، العنف المنزلي وسوء المعاملة، النظر لمؤسسة الزواج على أنها بس انحطت لحتى تكون خدمة للرجل، والتبعية أنه هي المرأة تابعة للرجل. وأكيد ببعض الدول أو بعض المناطق في إجحاف بعدم تقديم الرعايه الصحيه، هي اذا ما بدنا نحكي عن موضوع الختان والزواج المبكر اللي كمان انذكر قبل، والإجحاف الناتج عن انخفاض الأجور بين المرأة والرجل. كمان هلا أخيرا بالنسبة للسلام الوطني والإقليمي وهو عنصر أساسي والثالث بهذا الموضوع، إنه نجهل تجهيل نصف المجتمع واللي هي المرأة، قلنا هي نصف المجتمع، وتغييبها وحرمانها من المشاركة والإنتاج. هذا الشيء بيؤدي لنعمل خلل على صعيد الاستقرار بهالمجتمع، وتعريض السلام العالمي للخطر من حيث الإصلاح. إصلاح وضع المرأة، كرمال هيك نحن بحاجة لنعمل إصلاح بالتشريعات والقوانين لنقدر نخلي المرأة تلعب دور أساسي بنشر الثقافة وبناء السلام. في عوامل بتأثر سلبا على هيدا الدور. شو العوامل بتأثر إنه المرأة تكون شريك أساسي بلعب ببناء السلام؟ عدم احترام القوانين اللي بتكفل حماية النساء خلال النزاعات المسلحة، ما في تطبيق التشريعات الدولية الكفيلة بأننا نضمن حقوق السياسية والاجتماعية للمرأة، قصور المؤسسات الأهلية الناشطة بمجال حقوق المرأة. وهون أنا تحديدا يعني ذاكرة إنه هذا الشيء يمكن ما كثير موجود بلبنان، بس كثير موجود بسوريا، كثير موجود باليمن، كثير موجود بالعراق. هلا يمكن مؤخرا صاروا عم يشتغلوا بالعراق ببعض المناطق مثل كركوك وغيرها على هذا الموضوع. إقصاء المرأة عن ميادين الخدمة العامة أو يكون عندها دور سياسي، وتغييب لدور المرأة بحل النزاعات الإقليمية أو الدولية أو بمفاوضات السلام. كل هول عوامل سلبية تلعب دور بأنها تحد المرأة من تكون عامل أساسي ببناء السلام. من هون حنحكي عن أهمية دور المرأة كفاعلة ببناء السلام. بسنة 75 الأمم المتحدة باتفاقية بالمؤتمر اللي صار بالمكسيك اشتغلوا على انه يمكنوا المرأة لحتى تكون لها دور اساسي بعملية بناء السلام، واعتبر انه هو شرط اساسي لنجاح عملية التنمية واستدامتها وبالتالي تحقيق السلام الايجابي اللي حكينا عنه بالاول. اعتبروا اذا نحن بنقدر نمكن المرأة اجتماعيا وسياسيا حنكون عم نساعد بعملية التنمية المستدامة، وبالتالي بنوصل لعملية السلام الإيجابي وليس السلبي. ومن هون تعد قضية المرأة وتمكينها بتحقيق السلام هي واحدة من أهم القضايا، كان النظرية أو العملية. كمان النساء المشاركات بعمليات بناء السلام عادة بيركزوا أقل على موضوع غنائم الحرب، كرمال هيك بيركزوا أكثر على موضوع المصالحة والتنمية الاقتصادية والتعليم والعدالة الترميمية، وكلها هدول عناصر أساسية لحتى نكون عم نعمل سلام إيجابي ومستدام. ومن هون كان المرأة لها دور فعال ومحوري ببناء السلام من أسفل للأعلى. عم نحكي من أسفل الهرم لأعلى الهرم، أو بالعكس من أعلى الهرم لأسفل الهرم. وإذا بدنا نحكي هون عن أعلى الهرم لأسفل الهرم عم نحكي عن دور المرأة القيادي، إنها تكون بمركز قيادي أو مركز اتخاذ القرار. ضمان إجراء مفاوضات ناجحة لأنها تشمل ضمان مصالح المرأة. وهلا حكون عم بعطي مثل تحديدا من العراق، بما إنه كنا عم نحكي عن الأيزيديين، حنحكي تحديدا عن دور المرأة وشو لعبت المرأة الأيزيدية داخل المجتمع العراقي. تحقيق المساواة بين الجنسين لأنه بيعتبر مؤشر أقوى على سلمية الدولة من المؤشرات الأخرى كالناتج المحلي الإجمالي. قبل ما انتقل للسلايد الأخير كمان عبالي أحكي عن موضوع الأيزيديين. بعد مشروع سنتين عمل بمنطقة سنجار تحديدا بالشمال العراق، انشغل مع النساء الايزيديات اللي تعرضوا للاغتصاب بالفتره الموجود كان فيها داعش على انه نشغل معهم سلام داخلي اولا، ونعمل معهم ما يسمى تروما هيلينج لحتى يقدروا ينقلوا هيدي الصوره على عيالهم واسرهم كانوا متزوجات او لا، على اسرتهم الصغيره. وبعد هيك من بعد عمليه سنتين من العمل معهم صاروا عندهم دور فاعل بمبادرات انعملت على الارض بسنجار لحتى يكونوا عم ينشروا ثقافه السلام. يعني صاروا هن عم يعملوا ما يسمى بير تو بير او قرين لقرين لاشخاص ايزيديات، نساء ايزيديات تعرضوا للاغتصاب وكان عندهم دور فاعل جدا بعمليه بناء السلام. حبيت اذكر هيدي المعلومه بما انه كان عم ينذكر حاليا. عبالي كمان شارك معكم تجربه اللي هي التجربه الكولومبيه، وحكون عم بعرض عليكم فيديو فيها. التجربه الكولومبيه نتيجه مشروع بال 2015 انعمل من USIP اللي هو مشروع كان بكولومبيا ليدعموا شبكه من النساء المشاركات ببناء السلام. الادوار اللي قامت فيها النساء تفاوضت هي مباشره على وقف اطلاق النار مع المجموعات المسلحه، ضغطوا على المتمردين ليرفعوا الحواجز من الطرقات وفكوا رهائن ووثقوا عمليه انتهاكات حقوق الانسان، بالاضافه انه نحتجوا على اولويات الميزانيه الحكومه المحليه، وهون عم نحكي عن الميزانيات الخاصه اللي بتروح حتى للنساء. كمان ندعوا لحتى يكونوا جزء من مفاوضات محادثات السلام اللي صارت بكولومبيا بهافانا، واللي كان نص المشاركين فيها نساء، وكانت هيدي تجربه كثير ناجحه لبناء السلام. الفيديو هو نتيجه التجربه الكولومبيه، هو مجموعه نساء اللي هي الشبكه اتفقوا مع الامات المشاركين بالعصابات او بالناس اللي عم تشارك بالنزاعات المسلحه بكولومبيا بحمله مدعومه من وزاره الدفاع الكولومبيه نفسها، وطلبوا من النساء انهم يعطوا صور لاولادهم هن واطفال ويكتبوا عليهم بمناسبه الميلاد، يعني بمناسبه الكريسماس تحديدا، انه انا اشتقت لتكون معي، ما اشتقت بس لصوره، بحاجه احضنك. وفعليا انتشرت هيدي الحمله بكل الاذاعات الكولومبيه، ومن هون رجع على البيت 198 مقاتل كانوا عم بيقاتلوا ضد الدوله الكولومبيه، وبالتالي الدوله الكولومبيه بالمقابل عملت عفو عن الناس اللي رجعوا. ومن هون بدنا نحكي عن دور المراه وتحديدا الام كامراه ببناء السلام ودورها بنشر ثقافه السلام بمنطقه مثل كولومبيا. كمان اسمحوا لي اعطي تجربه هيك وحكون عم بختم حاترك مجال للاسئله. كمان بالعراق بمناطق كركوك من لما طلعت داعش تقريبا بال 2018 انشغل على مشاريع بمناطق كركوك وصلاح الدين ان تكون المراه هي عنصر اساسي بلجان السلام اللي عم بتصير بالمنطقه، لانه لما فاتت داعش على المنطقه المراه كانت وحده من اكثر الضحايا اللي تعرضت للاغتصاب وللعنف. وهيدي كانت حاله نادره وحاله اضافيه اذا بدكم بمنطقه شمال كركوك، لانه المنطقه عشائريه واللي بيعرف المنطقه بنعرف عن شو عم يحكي، فلتكون النساء عنصر اساسي بلجان بناء السلام كانت من قصص النجاح اللي حققناها على الارض. بحب اختم، فاذا حدا عنده اسئله.
شكرا استاذه مايا، هالمساهمه فعلا مؤثره بشموليتها وبقوه اقناعها. رح نفتح المجال بعد اول شيء لاسئله لحضرتك من الجمهور، وبعدين عندنا تقريبا 10 دقائق تتخلص هيدي الحلقه، لانه في الحلقه التاليه لازم نحترم وقتها. انا عندي سؤال لحضرتك استاذه مايا، برايك ممكن السلام الايجابي من دون محاسبه؟ ومن ضمن المحاسبه ممكن بلا توقيف الفاعلين مرتكبين الجرائم ومحاكمتهم وسجنهم؟ هل بكفي عطف المرأة حتى ينرفع مسؤولية المجرم تجاه النساء وغير النساء؟
اكيد لا دكتور شبلي، وكرمال هيك نحن كنا عم نحكي عن التنميه والعداله، ولما بنحكي عداله عم نحكي عن عداله ترميميه او العداله التصالحيه اللي هو جزء منها المحاسبه او اعتراف الطرف بالخطا وبعدين الاعتذار وتقديم التعويض، وبالتالي الطرف الاخر بيعمل المسامحه. فهو جزء لحتى نحقق السلام الايجابي، هو جزء اساسي العداله الترميميه او العداله التصالحيه. لا ما بكفي بس انه المراه، نحن عم نحكي على صعيد المجتمع والوطن كوطن.
I have questions from the audience to Dr. Mann, but I would like, if there is an occasion specifically for a question to Ms. Gizzini, please send me the note immediately. All right, let's then go ahead with the more general panel. Dr. Mann, the question that I have for you is from Mr. Terjanian. He says, with regard to your characterizations of the measures intended to prevent forced birth, is it possible to achieve a slower quote-unquote genocide by a government strategically placing quote-unquote birth control facilities in regions inhabited by the population segment targeted for genocide and not other regions without forcing anyone? I'm thinking of the Kurds, the Berber, Amazigh people, the Uyghurs, etc. You must unmute yourself before answering us.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think, can one, I mean, can one talk about genocide if such, one could only talk about genocide if such contraceptive or abortive measures were forced upon people. If the women choose to take, to use contraception or to have abortion, they have rights over their own bodies. Any measures sort of restricting female sexual autonomy is extraordinarily dangerous against human rights. Because I don't think they're feeding contraceptives into the water or, like they used to do with the fluoride. I don't think something like that is happening. The fact that they do sometimes when women give birth, in cesarean births or otherwise, that their ligatures and this kind of operation is performed, that has happened, but not in a specifically genocidal purpose as far as I know. I don't know, do I answer the question?
I think it's a very good answer. I don't know if Mr. Janyan, he will get back to us if he wants to follow up. I was wondering whether the panelists would engage each other as well. I think that would be interesting.
I had written something. I don't know if you had seen my chat, but I made a comment, which I'll just read. Don't you think that demilitarization of our values in societies is the core issue through education, media, etc.? War is the metaphor for just about everything. It's used for COVID here, I mean, it's used for sales, for selling clothes. I mean, war is the metaphor for a marketing metaphor. So these are, well, you may not like the feminist vocabulary, hyper-masculinist values our societies need to get rid of because they also define women's vulnerabilities and diminished status. When we're talking constantly of protection of women, this is assuming that women are fragile little things and they can't take those decisions themselves to protect themselves. You see, as long as we keep on thinking that women need protection, that means that Mr. Muscle out there, whoever's the Tarzan of the game, versus somebody who isn't Tarzan, is the one who's calling the shots. I mean, their core values to our society, be it from military toys to what we see in the media. Now, the question that maybe we should be asking after what's just happened now in Karabakh is, with the use of drones, this is going to reduce men and women and as victims. Whatever happens, they're victims on the same level. Once you start removing the human element, is that going to change? That's a separate question, but it does pose enormous questions in terms of victims, differences of victims and needs of protection. Okay, these are two questions, two comments.
Dr. Abishdid, would you like to tackle this?
Actually, I wanted also to add something. I was waiting for my colleagues to finish. I wanted to say something that is very important regarding, since we have invoked also, rape and all this sexual violence during wars. In fact, the problem is that in countries like in the Middle East, we are still looking at this crime as an offense, at this act as an offense against honor, and not as a crime. This is the problem. This is why we're falling into impunity. And we have to correct what is called the mischaracterization of rape that we have in this region. Because when we have to look at rape as torture, for example, because torture is criminalized, as the inhuman treatment that I mentioned during my presentation. We have to look at it as if it is an intentional or a willful causing of suffering, great suffering, or serious injury to the body or to health. So once we start to look at this and to tackle this issue in this way, we can end this this impunity regarding rape and any sexual violence. But since we're consider it as an act, against honor or something like this, we will be always ending with impunity. So this is a very important point that I wanted to add to.
Yes, this is a very powerful point, both on the issue of victim and protection, and on the issue of characterizing gendered violence. It does raise a legal problem that I've seen in the cases. One of them has been at the level of the distinction between genocide and crimes against humanity, especially that rape in particular is under crime against humanity, and it took some effort from the courts, the international courts, to bring it also under the canopy of genocide. But you're raising a question which is a little bit more delicate, I think, from a legal point of view. And that is when one talks about rape and other forms of physical violence against women. Now, of course, one can put it under the rubric legally of torture. And the Convention Against Torture is a very powerful convention. There isn't a convention against rape, although it might be an interesting development for international law, in the same way as torture is condemned by a convention, that the Convention Against Rape or other gendered violence could be conceived for international law. But it does raise the question. I mean, if rape as a crime is condemned, why does one need torture? So it's not very clear necessarily that there is an advantage to put rape under torture, because rape as such is condemned and criminalized under both domestic and international law. I'm being pressed by my supervisors here to close this very interesting panel. I was wondering whether I wouldn't ask Ms. Jazzini to close it, please. Ms. Amaya, the last word.
بحب أقول شكرا لك دكتور وشكرا للجميع، يعطيكم ألف عافية.